We've been covering Professor Richard Wolff's economic update on here once a week. He's been hitting it out of the park, different issues every time. And this particular discussion here is about homelessness, poverty, wages. The title of this video is called Economic Update, Record Homelessness Defies U.S. Solutions. So I'm going to play a little bit of this here and chime in between, because there's some things that Professor Richard Wolff says here that I think are incredibly important. And I think we need to pay very close attention to in reference to the economic situation in this country and poverty. So let's go ahead and get into that.
My next update has to do with California. Under current law in California, the minimum wage will rise to $15.50 in 2023. Mind you, that's a few months away, and that would make the minimum wage in California over double that of the minimum wage, $7.25, on the federal level in the United States. By 2025, under existing California law, it will rise again to $16.50. Now, there was a new law getting ready to be put on the ballot in California, the Living Wage Act, that would have raised all of that to $18 an hour by 2025. And that would have raised the income of 5 million Californians, one quarter of the labor force. It shows that at the state and local levels, legislation favoring labor is possible, exists, has been passed in ways that in other parts of the country don't exist.
Let's chime in here for a second. I want you to hear this last bit one more time, because this is something that I've been pointing to again about those of you that are still passionate about electoral politics. I want you to listen to what he just said about labor.
To $18 an hour by 2025. And that would have raised the income of 5 million Californians, one quarter of the labor force. It shows that at the state and local levels, legislation favoring labor is possible, exists, has been passed in ways that in other parts of the country don't exist.
Let's chime in there for just a second. Now, obviously, I think people should make more than that in California, because California is incredibly expensive. But to echo what he was just referring to about the local level, this is why I keep telling people that local politics is more important than national politics. And he just brought up an example in reference to labor and wages. When we look at some of the policies that were on Bernie Sanders' platform or any progressive platform that was running 2018, 2020, even this year, 2022, some of those policies have already been implemented at the local level. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Fight for 15. Seattle implemented that. California implemented that. Massachusetts implemented that. We implemented that years ago. If you look at something like legalizing marijuana, we implemented that years ago. If you look at a policy like paid family leave, Massachusetts implemented that last year. This is why I tell people it is so important that if you're still really passionate about trying to get something done through electoral politics, then your focus should be on the local level, not so much on the national level. We really don't have control over what happens politically in DC. We really don't. We can organize on the outside and put pressure on the politicians that way, but we're not on the inside and we have no say-so there in DC. When it comes to local politics, though, it's different. I can see my mayor. I can see my governor. I don't have access to the politicians in DC. So what you can do One of the things that can be done is ballot initiatives. We've talked about this before. If you live in a ballot initiative state, you need to take advantage of that. Massachusetts is a BI state. California is a BI state. Take advantage of that. What are the questions that are on the ballot for this November? You don't have to necessarily go vote for a congressperson. Let's say you don't want to vote for any of those people. Fine. But don't ignore the questions or the ballot questions on the local level. That's actually how we legalized marijuana here in Massachusetts. That was a ballot question. So don't ignore that part of it. So ballot initiatives. There's also state legislature. Also, you have a better chance of putting pressure on your local politicians than you do the politicians in DC. And I've seen that happen here as well. So just remember what he said about the labor. If you talk about the fight for 15, if you talk about these labor laws, you have a better chance of pushing back on that at the local level than you do on the national level.
Working people are much better off in California than they are in those other parts. There's simply no way around that. Current calculations as to what a family needs, 2 adults and 1 child, if there's a single wage earner, needs to get $40 an hour for basic, decent living.
$40 an hour for basic, decent living. Most people I know don't make $40 an hour. Just something to think about there. So even when we say, let's increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, that still isn't enough. And this is why Richard Wolff has said this before. Technically, the minimum wage, if you adjust for inflation, it should actually be like 30 something, not $15. So we're already behind.
If you have 2 adults and 1 child, but 2 wage earners, they would have to get at least $24 per hour. Even California, with among the most progressive approaches to minimum wages, doesn't come close in the United States to providing, quote, a decent minimum to its families. That tells you a lot, or it should, about where the American economy is, for the vast majority of us. Not for those who own the media, who are the politicians, who run the corporations. Yeah, they tell us what they would like us to believe, but these statistics tell us how it really is. I come next.
And I'm going to chime in here for just a second. And that goes back to that pull yourself up by the bootstraps theory. Maybe that's something that may have worked, I don't know, 7 decades ago. But today, that is obviously much more difficult to do, because if you listen to the breakdown that Professor Richard Wolff just gave you, if you need to make $40 a day, $40 an hour in California, if you need to make that basically just to make a living, to get by, then how do you pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you're not even making that? If you're making $7 an hour, how do you pull yourself up by the bootstraps when you can't even afford to pay for your rent? This is the problem. The wages are suppressed. We definitely need to demand some type of a living wage in this country. I don't want this whole increase the minimum wage anymore. I think we need to have what's called a living wage, because the minimum wage, it's not like that's the minimum that you need to make a living here. That's not enough to even just get by. So what's interesting is, like, it's called the minimum wage, which means this is how much they're supposed to legally pay you, but it's not like that minimum wage is just enough for you to actually live your life, to pay your rent, to buy food. It's not enough for that, which would mean that if you are making minimum wage, you most likely would have to get a second job. You see the problem? Let's go back in.
Next, and I do this with pleasure, to the current mayor of Boston, Massachusetts. Her name is Michelle Wu. A strike at Starbucks started there July 18th of this year. And she went and marched with the strikers. She's the Boston mayor at this.
I just want to chime in here. Yeah, so that's Mayor Michelle Wu, Boston mayor. I will add, like, I give her kudos for marching with the workers, but I also want to add in here, there's some things about Michelle Wu when it comes to the housing situation here in Boston where she has not been good at. She's allowing these housing complex to basically just fall apart so that the people are pushed out, and allowing developers to come into Black and brown communities to tear the buildings down and rebuild condos in their space. So when it comes to housing, she's horrible. And I confronted her about this. There's a video on my channel. You can go back and find it. I forget the name of the video. Eric might be able to tell you guys. But she was supposed to be the progressive per se in the race. And then she won. And then you see she's operating just like any other, Democrat. So she has allowed developers to come in, push lower income people out of Boston. They now have a further commute. It's been terrible. If you're working class and you're working class and you grew up in Boston and you're still working class today, it is very, very difficult to make it there. Very difficult. And Boston hasn't been able to get a handle on the housing situation for I don't know how long. I've been here over 10 years and the housing situation was a problem when I moved here. So that hasn't been fixed, regardless of the mayor I've had. Michelle Wu hasn't fixed that. She's actually made it worse. Marty Walsh didn't fix that. He made some promises that he would, didn't happen. And Mayor Menino, who was mayor for over like 20 years, he didn't fix that problem either. This is why I tell you guys a lot of times it doesn't matter which person you put in. They all run on one thing and then they get in and just like, whatever. So I give her kudos for marching with the workers, but she's still screwing people over when it comes to the housing situation in Boston, and she needs to get a handle on that.
Time. And I want to read to you her statement. I am here because I want you to know very clearly that the city of Boston stands with you. We are going to make sure that Boston continues to lead the way in fighting for safe working conditions and the benefits and wages and respect that you all deserve. She was speaking to the Starbucks strikers. Their demands include $25 per hour before tips, as well as job condition improvements. This is another form of labor militancy.
There you go.
Labor is the majority. Labor has the votes. Capital has the money, but labor has the votes, and politicians know it. And if labor becomes more militant, as is happening, you can see it in the struggles to unionize. You can see it in the struggles to strike. You can see it in the struggles to improve minimum wages. We like to document major steps along the way in this process. Well, here's another one. When the connection between a growing militant labor movement is made clear to local politicians, it turns out that you can get levels of support from them that a year or two ago would have been thought unachievable.
And that's true. Again, when it comes to politics on the local level, you have more of an ability to have access to them, to talk to them, and to try to get them to come out and support these events. I wouldn't have been able to just go up and talk to Michelle Wu if she was a congresswoman. You see the difference? That's the thing. And the $25 an hour that the Starbucks workers are asking for here, and I had one of the workers on the show. This is the Starbucks on Comm Ave at BU, at Boston University. And he came on to talk about the things that were happening there and what they're asking for. And some people may hear this and they may think $25 is too much money to ask for. I want to let you know that $25 an hour in Boston, that's nothing. That doesn't go far here. So what they're asking for is really just something that they can be able to get by on so they can pay their rent. But it's not a lot of money here.
I don't want to take away from Michelle Wu's mayoral position and decision to do what she did. But it is not something that can be restricted to Boston. And it is something everyone listening or watching this program ought to be thinking about. What's possible if you mobilize and you organize may surprise you. My last update for today is about a gentleman. His name is Matt Holman, Holman. He was the Food and Drug Administration's top science regulator of the tobacco industry. Remember, the tobacco industry knew for decades that nicotine had all kinds of unwanted health effects, and other parts of smoking cigarettes could and did damage your lungs, even causing mass fatalities, which led to a whole lot of legal wrangling, congressional action, and all the rest. So the Food and Drug Administration was a leading agency, and their man, Matt Holman, was the scientist who was supposed to decide what the science was, and then on the basis of that, what the government should do about the toxic dimensions of the cigarette industry. Well, he announced his retirement after 20 years. And he also announced that he will be joining a corporation whose name you all know, Philip Morris. Okay, what does it mean if a leading official of a government regulatory agency takes a job with the industry they supposedly were supervising, controlling, monitoring, and regulating? In the world of industry, it's called regulatory capture. It's when the regulated capture the regulators, which, from the point of view of the regulated, is exactly what you want.
Regulators! I had to do that. Sorry, guys.
If you can't stop a regulation, well, capture the regulator. And how do you capture him? Well, you offer him a really good job, or at least the prospect of one. And if you didn't offer it, he'd have it in his mind. And you know why? Because he knows the story of Matt Holman, which is reproduced by many others. Matt is not alone. I don't mean to pick on him. He is an exemplar. It's all about the overlap between business and the government, which you ought to worry about because it affects us all.
That's right.
We've come to the end of the first part of today's show. And for those of you who may not,
so that's the end of the first part. Like I said, like there's 2 parts to this, so you can watch the other part. Did I get to? I didn't get to that part.
Precarious situation. I think you very well know in New York City where we both.
Here we go. All right, I want you to hear this part as well.
Based in New York City. His work focuses on changing people's fundamental relationship to land and housing. He works with social movements all around the world, especially related to access to land and housing, to debt issues, and police violence. And he does that in a human rights framework. He lectures widely at many different universities, and currently he's an adjunct professor of urbanism in the Design and Urban Ecology program at Parsons New School University in New York City. So first of all, Rob, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, Mr. Wolff.
All right, let me start with a new report. City advocate Jermaine Williams reports in his latest report that there are 80,000 New York City residents listed as homeless.
80,000, you guys. That's just in New York City.
Can you just give us, and I know this is difficult, but in your own words, in a short summary way, what does this mean? How do we get our heads around 80,000 people in the city of New York that have no home? What does it mean for them? And what does it mean for the larger community?
So thank you. First, let me say I think that number is a low estimate. I might make the argument, I think I could make a valid argument for the number being close to 150,000. Because when you talk about homelessness, you're talking about people in shelters, you're talking about families doubled up, you're talking about people living on the streets, and I'm not so sure we do the best or the most accurate count when we can. There's a federal count that takes place every year, counting people on the streets, and I'm not so sure how accurate that is. But I think
I just want to chime in here for a second, and I just want to explain something. Homeless doesn't mean that you're sleeping outside on the street. That's the most visible sign of homelessness that you'll be able to see. But homeless means you're unhoused as well. So if you're sleeping on your friend's couch, or if you're sleeping in your car, you don't have a place of your own, you are still homeless. And oftentimes those people are not counted when the government does these types of counts. They're mainly going out to look for people on the street that don't have a dwelling. They're sleeping on park benches, or they're sleeping in the subway, that kind of thing. Visible homelessness, where they usually I would say mess up, actually, where they usually kind of mess up with this count, is that they're not counting people who are not necessarily visibly homeless. People who, just like I told you, might be sleeping in their car or might be crashing on a friend's couch. Those people oftentimes are left out of that data. So just keep that in mind.
the fundamental issue is rents rising faster than wages. And that's always going to put people in a strange and precarious situation. I think you very well know in New York City, where we both are, rents are upwards of $5,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. And I think the outer boroughs are no bargain either. You go to places like Brooklyn, it's around $3,500. The Bronx lowered, believe it or not, to about $2,200. But these are high numbers, and this is difficult for people to deal with.
Why is now the time when we're hearing that these are record numbers? The 80,000 in that report is listed as a record high in the history of the city of New York. I mean, what's going on that makes it bad now? And especially given that, at least, I mean, you know better than I do, of course, decades and decades of talking about this, of commissions about this, of reports about this, out of politicians promising to deal with it. Why? I mean, not only did they not solve the problem, but we're at these records. What's going on?
They exacerbated the problem. So let's start with the pandemic and sort of work backwards. The pandemic exacerbated an ongoing issue. This issue is not new, as you clearly laid out. It's been in existence for a number of years here and around the country. But the solutions that people in power have come up with don't work. They failed, right? Because there's a fundamental issue of when somebody is homeless, it's because they don't have a home. So our answer has been in places like New York is to put people in shelters. A shelter is not a home. It doesn't surround you with the sense of community, with the sense of medical that you may need to work on a problem like this, or to end this particular problem.
Yeah. And also I want to add in here as well, it's not easy to necessarily get into a homeless shelter. There's curfews. They can only have a certain amount of number of people in. Some homeless shelters won't allow women. Some homeless shelters won't allow children to come in with you. So if you're homeless and you have a child, there are certain shelters that will not let you come in and stay. The other thing you have to worry about if you're at a homeless shelter as well, you got to worry if someone's going to steal your stuff while you're sleeping. You have to worry about someone attacking you while you're sleeping. These are a lot of the things that happen that are not talked about when people say, oh, just go stay in a homeless shelter. I mentioned curfew. If you're homeless and you have a job, and yes, some homeless people have jobs, and your job is in the evening. Well, if there's a curfew and your job is a waitress and you have to close at night, are you going to make that curfew to get back in time to get inside the homeless shelter? Not necessarily. So these are things that people need to know. Homeless shelters also have a lot of rules. So for example, if you are intoxicated, or if you may be a victim of substance abuse. You may not be allowed to come into the homeless shelter. So that is not a fix. It should not be a long-term solution. That is more looked at like a temporary thing. The long-term solution and plan should be to get them homes, but also you have to do something about the rent, because rent control, I think, should have stayed a thing. And rent control has gone away. At least in Boston, it's gone. Like, we haven't had rent control here, I think, since the 90s. So there's no rent control. There's no rent stability. The landlords can increase the rent as much as they want to. And this is why more people are being evicted. So if you had people in these cities like Boston and New York City that were shut down during the pandemic, and they didn't have their jobs, and they weren't making any kind of money, and they didn't have money to pay the rent, by the time people started issuing out the stimulus checks for some of those people, it was already too late. So where did they go? They were evicted. Let's go back in.
Problem. And I think we have to get more creative of using vacant spaces, right? We'd rather rent for profit rather than take the money that we spend on homelessness, which is a problem in New York. We spend close to $5 billion a year in New York City to try to handle this issue, but we're not handling it. We're just sweeping it to the side. And I think part of the problem is a law that came into effect in 1989 in New York called the Right to Shelter Law, which we're hearing a lot about now because migrants out of Texas are being sent to New York because of this law. What that law essentially says is if somebody comes to the city on a given night and says, I want a shelter bed, the city is obligated to give them a shelter bed. And sometimes that sits for solving the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. That sweeps it to the side. People are homeless because they don't have a home. So we have to come up with better solutions.
That's right.
You know, I've heard the following statistic, which is in Jermaine Williams's report again, that the shelter, as you point out, was always designed to be a temporary way station to what is a permanent or would be a permanent solution. And yet, families in the latest year for which they have documentation, which I believe is 2020, the average number of days in a shelter by a homeless family in New York City was listed as 500 days. In other words, we were sticking people into the temporary shelter and they were there more than a year and a half. Isn't that a sign of failure of a system?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a sign of failure. And that's what brought me to this work. I think you probably know my own personal story. I'm formerly homeless. I spent 10 months in a New York City shelter, and I was told, you were only in there for 10 months? Wow. And I thought that was problematic. I thought a shelter should be something that was temporary, 30 days, for a month, and then you had to find a permanent solution. But shelters have become homes in New York City and other places around the country for people. They've become permanent solutions, right? Because our elected and appointed officials can't seem to come up with problem solving. And part of that reason is because they've never experienced the problem. They're trying to figure out something they know nothing about. Bring in people who have this lived experience, who understand what they went through, who knows what led them into the situation to help resolve the issue. I do think we're moving in that direction a little bit in New York City. We have somebody named Jessica Katz, who is our chief housing officer. And one of the first things she did, which other mayoral administrations had never done, was put out a report, a homelessness and housing blueprint. In the past, they've always been separated. It made no sense. Why are you separating these two issues? You're homeless because you don't have a home.
That's right.
So whatever you're doing to solve housing solutions should include homeless people. But the city has always taken a road that they would separate the two. And
that's right. That's right. I have to move on to the next story, but I do want to just say here, I think we've seen this happen multiple times before where the people who are the most affected are not included in the decision-making process. So if you're trying to figure out how to solve or fix the housing situation, why are you not including people who are homeless, who are at those shelters? Why are you not including them as a part of that process in the decision-making? I think it's because some people are afraid of them. I think some people are afraid of homeless people. Why? I'll go to some of the comments here on YouTube. JB says Florida is implementing a $15 minimum wage right now. It was voted on via ballot initiative. That's right. That's right. See, that was done on the local level. Alice says local and state is critical for any political activity, citizens initiatives. Here in Southeast Corner, Arizona ballot initiatives on water regulations. There you go. At Kid, Sabby, all reasonable working folks understand we must have a true living wage for society to effectively work. Yet those in power don't want that. Why? That's a good question, a kid. Simone, landlords raise the rent right about the feds approve. Oh, sorry. Landlords raise the rents, I think, right about the time the feds approved the emergency rental assistance because it was guaranteed money. But now people have to figure out how to pay the increase. There you go. JB says, I'll be talking about homelessness on RBN this Sunday. Awesome, guys. Make sure you check that out. JB's show is on Sunday on RBN.